Hi everyone. A while back, I uploaded my first sci-fi trim sheet tutorial. Since then, I've continued experimenting with different approaches to creating trim sheets. In this video, I'll show you a workflow for designing custom panel layouts from scratch, giving you much more control over the final look of the trim sheet. I usually start by sketching the panel layout freehand in Photoshop. This lets me quickly experiment with different panel arrangements before cleaning everything up and developing the final trim sheet. Since this process is fast, I'll often create several variations before settling on the arrangement I like best. After that, I create a new layer group and use the pen tool to trace over the sketch, refining the panel design as I go. The thickness of the stroke depends on the intended scale of the paneling. I sometimes make the lines slightly thicker than I ultimately want, but it's important to keep the overall scale in mind. If the lines are too thin, they'll barely be visible on larger models. If they're too thick, the panels can end up looking like they're floating above the surface. At this stage, the goal is simply to make sure every panel line is represented by a pen tool stroke. I also make sure there's a border stroke around the entire trim sheet. This helps prevent the texture from ending abruptly at the tile boundaries, resulting in cleaner and more seamless transitions when the texture is tiled across a model. Once that's done, I clean up the layout by refining all of the line intersections. This involves switching between the path selection tool and the direct selection tool to reposition the endpoints so each intersection lines up cleanly and accurately. I also add simple panel silhouettes along the edges of some panels to make their shapes more visually interesting. I try to distribute these details evenly throughout the trim sheet while keeping the design clean. In most cases, simpler is better. Once everything is in place, I hide the sketch layer and merge the panel lines with the panel silhouettes into a single layer. Next, I create a new layer, fill it with a base panel color using the paint bucket tool, and then subtract the merged panel lines from it. This resulting layer serves two purposes. It becomes the base color for the panels, and it also allows me to easily select individual panels for further editing. Next, I create a new layer group and move the base panel layer inside it. I then load the base layer's pixels as a selection and apply that selection as a layer mask to the group. This way, anything I add inside the group will automatically be confined to the panel shapes. Finally, beneath the group, I add a darker background layer to make the panel lines stand out more clearly. Next, I created a new layer inside the group. Using a hard round brush with white, I painted along the panel edges to create the edge wear. Because everything inside the group was constrained by the layer mask, I didn't have to worry about painting over the panel lines. What would normally have been a delicate and time-consuming process became quick, easy, and much more forgiving. Next, using a rust-textured brush, I added a base texture across the entire sheet. I found that almost any textured brush worked well, as long as it had crisp edges rather than soft, blurry ones. I also preferred to add more detail than I needed on a separate layer and blur it afterward, instead of repeatedly repainting on a single layer while trying to control the amount of detail. Then, I added another layer of texture by stamping a grunge brush across the entire panel. With every texture layer I added, I continually adjusted the opacity to keep the overall amount of detail balanced and prevent any single layer from becoming too dominant. After that, I used the base color layer to select individual panels and add subtle color variation. The key here was subtlety. I used low saturation colors to introduce visual interest without overwhelming the overall texture. Next, on a new layer, I used a soft brush to sample the color of each panel and gently painted over the center of the panels. This subtly softened the underlying textures, reducing their intensity while preserving the sharper details around the edges. Then, on a new layer, I used a soft brush with a dark red color to add subtle burn marks and color variation across the panels. I typically started at the corners of each panel and gradually build up the intensity. Balance was key here, so I made sure the effect was distributed evenly across all the panels. Next, on a new layer, I added scratch marks by stamping a scratch-textured brush across the panels. In the brush's shape dynamic settings, I set the angle jitter to around 30% so the brush rotated slightly with every stamp. This helped break up repetition and made the scratches look more natural across the entire trim sheet. At this point, I darkened the background layer to increase the contrast and make the panel lines stand out more clearly. Finally, I added another layer of texture using a charcoal textured brush. Then, on a separate layer, I made the finishing touches, which included refining the edge wear, adding subtle color variation, and painting in a few more texture details where needed. As a final adjustment, I reduced the thickness of the panel lines by loading the base color layer as a selection, expanding the selection slightly, and replacing the existing group layer mask with the expanded one. This narrowed the visible panel gaps and gave the trim sheet a cleaner, more refined appearance. The amount of final adjustments largely depended on the desired outcome. I could have taken the trim sheet further by adding more details, color variation, and weathering. But for this tutorial, I wanted to keep the process simple and focus on the core workflow. Once you understand these fundamentals, you can build on them and push the level of detail as far as your project requires. So this is how the final texture turned out. As you can see, the workflow is fairly straightforward, and most of the time is spent layering simple techniques to gradually build up detail. I hope this process gives you a few ideas that you can incorporate into your own trim sheet workflow. If you found this tutorial helpful, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps support the channel and lets me know you'd like to see more content like this. If you have any questions or suggestions for future tutorials, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.